Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, America's citadel of free speech for 94 continuous years. My name is Sanjeev Kapoor, and I am president of the City Club. 1 week before September 11, 2001, our speaker, Robert Mueller, became the 6th director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 9/11 changed our outlook of the world and that of the FBI. What had been an agency that focused on apprehending criminals became more concerned about preventing terrorism. As a result, in the last 5 years, the FBI has thwarted over 100 potential terrorist attacks in this country. Just yesterday, the FBI arrested 7 terror suspects in Miami who apparently were looking to attack the Sears Tower in Chicago. The FBI's transformation has, of course, posed some challenges. In recent weeks, there have been reports about veteran FBI agents in the field who are leaving because they are being forced to Washington, D.C. Criticism has been leveled against the FBI for maintaining an inaccurate terror watch list that has led to innocent Arab Americans being detained at airports. In the last month, the FBI also has been at the center of a controversy over its power to investigate Congress. When it appeared that President Bush might require the FBI to return evidence that had been seized at Congressman Jefferson's office, Robert Mueller, along with the Attorney General, signaled to the White House that they might resign if that occurred. Robert Mueller's life is one that has been punctuated by public service. After graduating from Princeton College, he became a Marine Corps platoon leader in Vietnam. He was wounded in combat. That earned him a Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. He told one magazine that one of the reasons that I went into the Marine Corps was because we lost a very good friend, a Marine in Vietnam, who was a year ahead of me at Princeton. There were a number of us who felt we should follow his example and at least go into the service. That does not mean that Mr. Mueller does not respect conscientious objectors of the Vietnam War. He has stated they deserve a huge amount of credit for taking a principled stand. When he became a lawyer, Mr. Mueller's commitment to public service continued. He 3 times left lucrative positions at large law firms to work for the government as a prosecutor. Over his career, before being named to head the FBI, he worked in the U.S. Attorney's offices in San Francisco and Boston, and with the Attorney General offices in 3 administrations, both of the Bush administrations and the Clinton administration. Many attribute his appointment as FBI director to his success in turning around the troubled U.S. Attorney's office in San Francisco. It was thought that those skills could be brought to bear on a troubled FBI that he took over in 2001. In terms of his personal life, Robert Mueller married his high school sweetheart, Anne. They have 2 daughters, one of whom was born with spina bifida. Press reports indicate that she was raised to be a feisty and independent world traveler. Mr. Mueller is known to be a workaholic who regularly puts in 12 hours a day that often include briefing the president twice a day. Part of his success in life may have to do with the discipline with which he lives. The press has reported that an invitation to dinner to the Mueller household comes with an understanding that the party ends at 9 p.m., as this is the time he is known to go to sleep. Please join me in extending a warm City Club welcome to the FBI Director, Robert Mueller. Thank you.
I want to thank you for that kind introduction. It's indeed an honor to be here and able to talk to one of the most well-respected series that you have in the United States. Let me start by talking a little bit about what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. In recent weeks, we have watched the Toronto terrorism investigation unfold, and to date, in Canada, 17 suspects have been arrested in an alleged terrorist plot to bomb several prominent buildings in Toronto and in Ottawa, and also, according to public reports, to behead the Prime Minister. These men did not merely talk of taking action. They tried to purchase 3 tons of ammonium nitrate, and that is 3 times the amount used in the Oklahoma City bombing. And although the Canadian authorities uncovered this plot before these men harmed anyone, we face that sobering fact that yet another group of extremists planned a terrorist attack and took steps to execute that attack. Like the terrorists responsible for both the London and the Madrid bombings, the Toronto suspects lived in the area they intended to attack. They were not sleeper operatives sent on suicide missions. They were students and business people and members of the community. They were persons who, for whatever reason, came to view their home country as the enemy. And I want to talk today about the changing shape of terrorism, and in particular, the threat of homegrown terrorism. I do want to talk about the radicalization process, how an extremist becomes a terrorist, and what we are doing to address this new threat. For more than a decade, Al-Qaeda has been the driving force of terrorism, moving thousands of people through training camps in Afghanistan and providing the motivation, the money, and the management for worldwide attacks. In the past 5 years, with our military, law enforcement, and intelligence partners around the world, we have disrupted Al-Qaeda's central operations. We have captured or killed many of their key leaders, including the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, as well as al-Zarqawi and many of his associates in Iraq. We have destroyed their training camps and disrupted both their funding and their means of communication. And through these efforts, we have transformed Al-Qaeda from a strong hierarchy that plans and executes attacks to being a decentralized and amorphous group. And unfortunately, while Al-Qaeda may well be weakened, it is not dead. We continue to face threats from Al-Qaeda and its offshoots in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in East Africa. And their plots included, in recent times, a plot to blow up a shopping mall here in the Columbus area, as well as the recently reported cyanide attack on the New York City subway system. But we also face threats from organizations affiliated with Al-Qaeda, like Ansar al-Sunnah in Africa and Jamaat Islamiyah in Southeast Asia. These groups continue to train, to recruit, and to plan attacks. But the chains of command are fractured, and they are not as stable as they were a number of years ago. And while we have made great strides in disabling traditional terrorist models like Al-Qaeda, the convergence of globalization and technology has created a new brand of terrorism. And today, terrorist threats may come from smaller, more loosely defined individuals and cells who are not affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but who are inspired by a violent jihadist message. And these homegrown terrorists may prove to be as dangerous as groups like Al-Qaeda, if not more so. We have already seen this new face of terrorism on a global scale in Madrid, in London, and in Toronto. And we have also witnessed this so-called self-radicalization here at home. In Torrance, California, for example, 4 men were indicted last year, charged with plotting to attack United States military recruiting facilities and synagogues in the Los Angeles area. In Toledo, 3 men were recently charged with conspiring to provide money, training, communications, computers to extremists in the Middle East. As alleged in the indictment, these men taught themselves how to make and use explosives, and they conducted their own training exercises, and they did it all here in Ohio. Just this morning, the FBI and the Department of Justice announced the indictment of 7 individuals involved in what appears to be another homegrown terrorist cell. The leader is a United States citizen living in Miami, and he and 6 others are alleged to have plotted to attack the Sears Tower in Chicago, as well as federal buildings in Miami-Dade. These extremists are self-recruited, self-trained, and self-executing. They may not have any connection at all to Al-Qaeda or to other terrorist groups. They share ideas and information in the shadows of the internet. and they gain inspiration from radical websites that call for violence. They raise money by committing low-level crimes that do not generate much attention, do not answer to a particular leader, but to an ideology. In short, they operate under the radar screen, and that makes their detection that much more difficult. To detect homegrown terrorists, it helps to understand the radicalization process. How does an individual become a radical extremist? And how does an extremist then become a terrorist? We have found that radicalization is fluid. It does not follow a set formula or a set timetable. Radicalization often starts with individuals who are frustrated with their lives or with the politics of their home governments. They may be US born, or as we saw in London, second-generation citizens. Some may be lonely or dissatisfied with their role in society. Others may have friends or mentors who encourage membership for social reasons. And once a person has joined an extremist group, he or she may start to identify with an ideology, one that encourages violence against a government and its citizens. They may become increasingly isolated from their old lives, drift away from family and friends, and spend more time with other members of the extremist group. As they become more and more involved in the group, they may decide to take action to support the cause, actions such as selecting targets, conducting surveillance, and raising money, procuring materials. And as talk moves to action, an extremist can become a terrorist. The evolution of extremism from extremism to terrorism can take place just about anywhere, from academic settings, prisons, and community centers to the internet. Schools and universities, for example, are both open as well as isolated. Many students are at an impressionable age and are seeking ways to establish their own unique identities. Prisons are also fertile grounds for extremists. Inmates may be drawn to an extreme form of Islam because it may help justify their violent tendencies. These persons represent a heightened threat because of their criminal histories, their propensity for violence, and their contacts with fellow criminals. The 4 suspected terrorists arrested last year in Torrance, California, were recruited by Kevin James, the founder of the radical group called JIS. James founded JIS from his cell in Folsom Prison in California. He recruited fellow inmates and radicals outside prison to join his mission, which was to kill those he saw as infidels. We are working with prison officials, academic leaders across the country to identify potential recruiting venues. But we must also identify the recruiters themselves, who sometimes act as the leaders of these homegrown cells. In recent cases, we have seen one key person, such as Kevin James, who brought the Torrance group together. But these are not always spiritual leaders. They can be mentors or friends, and regardless of their role, they can transform their followers from radicals to terrorists. Radical fundamentalists are particularly difficult to pinpoint in cyberspace. There are between 5,000 to 6,000 extremist websites on the internet, encouraging extremists to initiate their own radicalization and to cultivate relationships with other like-minded persons. And although we have destroyed many terrorist training camps in the past 5 years, extremists increasingly turn to the internet for virtual instruction. And of course, not every extremist will become a terrorist. But the radicalization process has become more rapid, more widespread, and anonymous in this internet age, making detection that much more difficult for all of us. And whether we are talking about al-Qaeda's operations overseas or sleeper operatives who have been in place for years, or the emergence of homegrown terrorists, our greatest challenge is in mapping these underground networks. This is and can be tedious, intricate work, but is absolutely essential to the safety of this country. We need to see how certain individuals fit into the big picture. We need to know where to set the tripwires to identify the line between the extremist and the operator. And to meet that mission, we are relying on 3 things. Number 1, firstly, intelligence. Secondly, technology. And thirdly, partnerships. Intelligence is key to preventing terrorist attacks. We must be able to transform bits and pieces of information into actionable intelligence and then disseminate that intelligence to the people who need it, all within an exceptionally tight time frame. In the past 5 years, we have doubled the number of intelligence analysts in the FBI and placed field intelligence groups in every one of our offices. Together, analysts, agents, linguists, surveillance specialists collect and analyze vital intelligence and share it with our partners in the law enforcement and in the intelligence communities. As part of this effort, agents and analysts in each of our field offices are taking a good, hard look at their communities. Here in Cleveland, for instance, we have learned more about the mass transit system, the ports on Lake Erie, and the many airports, airstrips, and heliports in the area. We increased our knowledge of Ohio's agricultural base and its key industries, academic institutions, and its people. And we call it knowing your domain. We need to know the risk factors and the potential targets for criminal and terrorist activity. And with this information, we can find and stop homegrown terrorists before they strike. Intelligence provides the information we need, but technology enables us to find the patterns and connections in that intelligence. Using searchable databases, we can track suspected terrorists through biographical information, travel histories, and criminal and financial records. Using our investigative data warehouse, agents, analysts, and law enforcement officers on joint terrorism task forces across the country can search any number of databases. In 2005 alone, users ran more than 10 million inquiries with an average response time of under 8 seconds. Our Terrorist Screening Center provides federal, state, and local officials with real-time connectivity to the terrorist watch list. We maintain a database of more than 200,000 known and suspected terrorists. And when a police officer encounters a suspicious person, that officer can access the screening center on the spot for further information and direction. But we are not the only ones making ready use of emerging technology. Terrorists are doing it as well. To keep pace, we must be able to identify the links between extremists and their activities. While technology provides the means to make those connections, partnerships are absolutely essential. With the emergence of homegrown terrorism, the role of our partners in state and local law enforcement becomes that much more important. They are the feet on the street, the first to see new trends in crime and in terrorism. The FBI is a relatively small organization with but 12,000 agents compared to 800,000 law enforcement officers across the United States. And that is why partnerships such as our Joint Terrorism Task Forces are so vital. Police officers and others from the federal government, including the CIA, the Secret Service, Department of Homeland Security, to name just a few, sit side by side with FBI agents and analysts, cooperating on investigations and sharing information with their own departments and agencies. In the Torrance investigation, for example, the police officers who arrested 2 of the suspects in what looked like a routine gas station robbery found evidence that these 2 were planning a terrorist attack. They passed the information on to the local Joint Terrorism Task Force. And together they traced the steps of these terrorists and exposed the entire cell. Without the initial information from the Torrance Police Department and the work of the Los Angeles sheriffs and police departments, we might not have made the connection between the terrorist criminal activities and their plans to undertake the attack. These partnerships also extend overseas. The ongoing Toronto terrorism investigation is an outstanding example of high-level coordination between international law enforcement and intelligence agencies in Canada, here in the United States, Denmark, Britain, Bosnia, Bangladesh, and in other countries. We have come together to share information and to address the terrorist threat. And we are investigating possible ties between the Toronto suspects and terrorist cells around the world. And we must continue to work together. We cannot stop global terrorism without global cooperation. As well, our partnerships with you in the private sector are equally important. Countering the spread of global terrorism will take more than just the capture of terrorist leaders. We are doubling our efforts to reach out to communities across the country. In recent months, we have hosted town meetings from Los Angeles to New York. We are also meeting with community leaders and minority groups to demystify the work we are doing. It's an important step in strengthening bonds between the FBI and the citizens we protect. There are those who view the FBI with suspicion, and we must build bridges to bridge that gap. We must build confidence in one another and forge lasting relationships. We want to improve our understanding of our communities by creating an open dialogue. And we need to reach the point where you are willing to come forward and say, I have seen or heard something that you need to know. We must also build relationships within the Muslim community to counter the spread of extremist ideology. Increasingly, mainstream Muslim leaders are challenging the extremist message of hatred and violence. And the radicalization cycle can only be broken if we stand together against terrorism. Just yesterday, representatives from the Muslim community met once again with FBI leaders at headquarters and in the field to talk about sharing of information and working together to prevent terrorism and to fight crime. It has been nearly 5 years now since the last terrorist attack on America. And yet there can be no room for complacency. As we have seen in recent months, our enemies are adaptive and evasive. They are taking full advantage of technology. They are combining their resources and their expertise to effect, and we must do the same. I will say that our greatest weapon against terrorism is unity. And that unity is built on information sharing and coordination among our partners in the law enforcement and the intelligence communities. It is built on partnerships with the private sector and effective outreach to the public as our eyes and ears. It is built on the idea that together we are smarter and stronger than we are standing alone. There is no one person, no one agency, no one police department, indeed no one country that has all of the answers. We may not always know the specifics as to where and when terrorists will attempt the next strike, but we do know that they will try again. And we must combine our intelligence, our technology, and our resources to stop them. We face many challenges today, both from overseas and from those living in our midst. But we must not let terrorism change our way of life. James Thurber, one of Ohio's native sons and one of the best-known writers and cartoonists of the 20th century, once wrote, "Let us not look back in anger, nor forward in fear, but around us in awareness." We cannot look back in anger, nor should we look forward in fear. Terrorism is designed to incite both fear and anger. Its very purpose is to make us afraid of what may happen, afraid of each other. Instead, let us look around in awareness of our citizens and our communities, and yes, of the dangers we face. But most importantly, let us look around in awareness of the strength of our democracy, the strength of our unity, and the strength of our resolve. Armed with these strengths, we cannot and we will not fail. Thank you for having me here today, and God bless.
Today, at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to Robert Mueller, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We will return to our distinguished speaker in a minute for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions for our speaker now while we break for a few announcements. We welcome all of you here today and those listening to WCLV 104.9 FM or one of the many radio stations across the country which carry these City Club forums. Radio broadcasts of the City Club are made possible through the generous support of Case Western Reserve University. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ, PBS, IdeaStream, and Adelphia. Television broadcasts are supported by John Carroll University, National City, and Nordson Corporation. And our live webcasts are supported by the University of Akron. Today's forum is the annual forum on the American justice system, which recognizes a very generous gift to our permanent endowment from City Club members Robert Fay, David Sindel, Myron Krodinger, Paul Walter, and Jesse Glassman, in memory of Samuel Glassman. We deeply appreciate this level of support and encourage everyone to consider a contribution to our endowment. With us today are guests at our City Club's President's Table, which is sponsored by the law firm of Tucker, Ellis & West. Each month, we invite these guests to join us for the Friday Forum experience as a way of introducing them to these excellent City Club programs. We hope they will join us in the future and thank Tucker, Ellis & West for their support. We would like to welcome guests at tables hosted by the law firm of Baker & Hostetler, Case Western Reserve University Law School, Charter One, the Council on American and Islamic Relations, and Key Bank. Thank you for joining us today. Now, we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are Marketing Director Missy Toms and City Club Summer Intern Christy Missig. First question, please.
Mr. Mueller, over here. Would you comment on our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which seems to be a wellhead for terrorists?
If you look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia over the years, it increased dramatically when there were attacks outside of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in May of 2003, and Al-Qaeda struck in the heart of Saudi Arabia. And I'll say that since 2003, our relationship with the Saudi authorities has been tremendously successful. And Saudi authorities have taken substantial steps and been successful themselves in addressing Al-Qaeda within the kingdom.
Mr. Mueller, I'd like to ask you a question using the term you used, which was radical fundamentalism. I noticed you didn't connect that to religion, but that's what I'd like to hear you respond to, because so much of radical fundamentalism has a religious connection. And what does that mean in terms of mosques and churches and other places of worship in our country where things like terrorist planning might go on?
I think in terms of a religion, it is not a religion that is the terrorist. Quite clearly, there are religions that have radical extremism within the span of ideology within a particular religion. But nonetheless, one has to focus on the individuals, the motivation of the individuals, which may be a religious ideology, may not be a religious ideology, but cloaked in a religious ideology. You cannot discount the fact that many of the terrorist attacks recently, certainly September 11th, were spawned by I would say, some current of Islam that is radical, fundamentalist, and shunned by most Muslims. But that does not mean that you focus on the religion, you focus on the individuals who present the threat to our society.
Mr. Director, you, over here, straight ahead.
Thank you very much.
You describe the transformation of an extremist to a terrorist, and while we certainly understand the focus of law enforcement today on radical Islam, what you described sounded exactly to me like Timothy McVeigh. My question, not so long ago, we were terribly concerned about people like McVeigh and groups like Posse Comitatus and that type of group. Perhaps using the Homeland Security's color code, could you tell us how the FBI assesses the risk from homegrown extremists who are not of the radical Islamist variety?
Well, I probably won't use the color scheme, but let me address the question in terms of, yes, you're absolutely right. We cannot take our eyes off the Timothy McVeighs who may be out there. Individuals can be, which is why I don't pin it down to a particular religion. Radicalization can come in a variety of guises. Certainly Timothy McVeigh was a radical and became a terrorist. We have not forgotten the threat within our country from those such as the militias or others. We have a very active and capable domestic, and I call it domestic terrorism program that makes certain that we put in the same types of tripwires that we're looking for international terrorism, the same types of tripwires we put into place within the United States.
Hi, I would like to comment that there was an unfortunate spin-off on the war on terrorism, some prosecutions that are questionable at best. Some examples would be that of Muslim chaplain Captain James Yee, Los Alamos scientist Dr. Lee, Texas Tech scientist Dr. Butler. The FBI has played a prominent role in these persecutions. What, if anything, has been done to protect citizens against this sort of thing?
Well, I think I would take exception to your description as persecutions. We have a system of justice here which gives everybody the presumption of justice. In each one of these occasions, the cases have gone through our justice system. And sometimes, and most times I would say, there are convictions, or sometimes there are not. But because a case is charged, goes through our justice system, and the person is acquitted does not mean that that is a persecution.
Mr. Mueller, many years ago, when I was a little boy, we played cops and robbers. It looks to me like the accoutrement that consists of many people that are there to protect you, including the two deflectors for weapons that are in front of you, that we have a similar situation here. Could you tell me why the cops and robbers story is wrong, or why there is such a feeling that cops and robbers are about to get us?
You look at what we say in terms of the necessity for security in this day and age. It is not something any of us are happy with in terms of some form of security. There are not deflectors in front of us. But nonetheless, security is an issue. And to the extent that you refer to the FBI as cops and robbers, yes, we're the cops, and have been for the number of years of our existence. And I will tell you that while we have a responsibility for national security, protecting against terrorist attacks, arresting spies, we also have the obligation to play and work with the police officers in addressing the criminal concerns in each of our communities. And while we have adapted and grown to meet the national security challenges that we face, we also have maintained our role as cops, protecting the public from the crimes that bedevil our communities.
Thank you for your speech. It was very informing. I have a question about part of the policy or the form of the FBI is the intelligence and technology, and the third part is partnership. Don't you think by the revealed new policies about eavesdrop without a court permission, search and seizure without a court permission, this can affect the partnership?
Well, I think, as I've said before, partnerships are absolutely essential to our success. Partnership with all communities, private communities, religious communities, partnerships with state and local law enforcement, partnerships with the intelligence community. But our challenge is to identify those persons who may have the idea to undertake a terrorist attack and stop that person before he is successful or she is successful in undertaking that terrorist attack. Someplace along that continuum, we have to identify the persons who are the threat to the United States. And you need the intelligence to do that. The FBI does that according to the Constitution, the applicable statutes, and the Attorney General's guidelines. And so on the one hand, we have the responsibility, the obligation to use what intelligence we legally can obtain to prevent that terrorist from undertaking that terrorist attack. On the other hand, one of our best ways of doing it is the partnerships with the various communities that I have described.
Director Mueller, since the tragic events of September 11th, there have been many reports in the media about FBI field agents who notified their superiors, often repeatedly, about their concerns of terrorists. My question is, how many of these superiors were fired? And if they weren't all fired, what message does that send to the rest of the people who work for you as far as dereliction of duty?
I would take exception to the predicate of the question. I do not believe throughout the United States or in our offices that the threats relating to terrorism do not get to the top. To the contrary, I'm briefed twice a day in terms of the threat situation in the United States. Every one of our field offices has a reporting process for any threats that may arise regardless of where the division is. I would say that the likelihood of such threats not getting to me are remote at this point. And so I'd have to disagree with you. I believe the system has changed substantially since then. Everybody in the Bureau, I think everybody in the intelligence communities understand the necessity for whatever information you have, the necessity for sharing that information with others so it can be part of the larger puzzle, a piece of that larger puzzle that will enable us to prevent the next terrorist attack.
You spoke very eloquently about protecting our American way of life. And that's very important to me as someone whose ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. Many of us Americans since 9/11 have felt actually a very precipitous decline in our protection for our revered constitutional principles. Do you ever wonder, sometimes deep, late at night, thinking that perhaps some of your policies and procedures may actually be hastening the decline of our way of life and our constitutional principles that we've revered for so many years? Do you ever worry about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a balance between civil liberties. Protecting the civil liberties are guaranteed to us by the Constitution, by the applicable statutes, and balancing that against the necessity of preventing a crime before it occurs. And whenever we have a procedure or a mechanism of gathering intelligence, a great deal of thought goes into what impact it may have, what the results may be, and doing that balancing to which you advert. I do think that we have the proper balance. I do believe that statutes like the Patriot Act have made us substantially safer. Today we can share information with the intelligence communities, and the intelligence communities can share information with us, which you could not do before the Patriot Act. So the changes that have been made since September 11th, in my mind, have made us substantially safer, and in doing so, we have balanced the civil liberties versus the protection that we receive, and I think it has been appropriately drawn. But we do worry about it.
Excuse me. Director, one of my concerns is for the marginalized individual who has been marginalized because of illness or disability or institutionalization, and how they get drawn into being goaded and misled by people because they are marginalized from the greater community. And they're very often used as volunteers for their sense of purpose with far radical groups. Are you aware of this?
I do not believe I have seen instances where persons with disabilities or otherwise marginalized have served the purpose of radical groups. I have not seen it, certainly in the United States. Certainly, persons who, with disabilities, certain persons who I wouldn't call them marginalized, I'd say persons perhaps with disabilities have been taken advantage of by fraudsters and the like. And I'll tell you that when it comes to white-collar crime and the efforts of those to undertake criminal acts against those who are not able to protect themselves, we take very seriously. We work with state and local law enforcement on healthcare task forces, for instance, to assure that this does not happen. But going back to your original question as to whether or not individuals with disabilities have been utilized by terrorists, I have not seen that.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You spoke on demystifying myths in different communities. Can you give us some of the many examples that myths that go on in the communities as far as the FBI role has played in those activities?
Well, it goes to the belief that the FBI is not there to protect everyone in the community, and we care about everyone in the community. Our outreach is to everyone in the community. As what I talked about is a necessity for unity, and there are those who have suspicions about the FBI. We have citizens academies in every one of our divisions so that we bring in persons from the community to show you exactly what we do, the predication that we base our investigations on before we go forward. And so I do think there are myths out there about the Bureau, misinformation, and our outreach is to demystify, to remove those myths about what we're doing or what we're not doing. I will tell you that one of our principal, our number two priority after public corruption on in the criminal side of the house is civil rights prosecutions and investigations. And to the extent that we have word of a hate crime against any group, any individual, we take it exceptionally seriously. In the wake of September 11th, we had any number of investigations that were opened because of threats or acts taken against the Muslim community, and every one of those instances we followed up on them. Now, often that word does not get out, and that is what we, in our outreach programs, we want you to know.
Director Mueller, in cases of overzealous enforcement of the FBI, where tens of thousands of Arab Muslim men have been pulled in and questioned, there's turned up no signs of terrorism. Locally, families have been broken up, Arab Muslim families, permanently. How can this help in unity and stopping the fear in the community? And how can this ever be justified with these families that are permanently disrupted?
Now, let me go back to in the wake of September 11th. We said on September 11th we had 3,000 of our fellow citizens have been killed, 2 towers at the Pentagon. We did not know what happened on those planes. We initially were able to identify the persons, the hijackers, all 19 of them, over a couple of weeks. We anticipated then a second wave. We did not think it was done. The decision to put the planes back in the air that afternoon was done without really knowing what had happened on the planes that had gone down. And to do that, we had to expand our investigation to persons who had associated, who were known, these hijackers, to determine whether there are any other cells in the United States. We interviewed thousands of persons. In the course of those interviews, there were persons who were facing criminal charges at the local level, criminal charges at the federal level, or were out of status and faced immigration charges. Whenever a person was detained for any particular, in the course of an interview, it was done pursuant to an appropriate legal process. Now, in the wake of that, we have changed our procedures to assure that when we get information about a particular person, it is vetted. There have been occasions where somebody will give us information that turns out to be erroneous, but we have to take the investigative steps that are necessary to protect the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Director, for your time and talking with us. You use terms like radicals and extremists and terrorists. However, you failed to define those terms. Could you please define those terms for us so at least I can better understand what your definition is, what the government's definition is of these terms?
A definition of a terrorist is somebody who wants to kill innocent men, women, and children for some political or religious reason. Extremist is a person who may have an extreme either political philosophy or a religious philosophy that may be a predicate, may be the foundation for taking the next step, which means, which would be terrorism and killing innocent men, women, and children.
I'd like to turn from the national and the international side back to your cooperation with the local and fire officials. I've had a chance to talk to some fire officials, and they said that they would
a Cuyahoga County, at least, wide network, so a fire engine at a site could call other fire engines if they needed them. I would like to broaden that and suggest maybe in your position, you might be able to get with somebody like OnStar, which already has satellite communication all over the North America, be absolutely free of worried about power, and would also have ground position sensing so you know exactly where they're talking about.
One of the challenges for the federal government, particularly in the United States, is the ability to communicate with each other on the federal level, on the state and local level. Unlike other countries where they have one police department covering the whole country, in the United States you have something like 18,000 state and local law enforcement entities. The budgets are allocated by the political structure in the town or the city and the like, and the communications are developed pursuant to budgets and procurements and the like, and not always with the view of being able to communicate with the rest of law enforcement, much less with the rest of the first responders, which I would include fire departments and the like. We're working at it. We're working at the federal level, we're working at the state and local level, and I know the Department of Homeland Security is looking at it from the perspective of the first responders, but we do have a ways to go.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller, for very enlightening comments. In fact, I do have a minor comment and a question. During your presentation, you mentioned the word jihadist. And this term, we as Muslims, I am a Muslim, we take exception to this because the word jihad is a very high level dear to our hearts and minds, and it is a very positive concept in Islam, which leads me to the question. Today's indictment in Miami, in fact, they mentioned that these people want to wage jihad. However, by their own account, this person said, or whoever his name, Brother Corey on CNN today, he said that they learn Christianity and Islam and they study the Bible. So for the casual observer, they are non-Muslims. However, this word has been used to cast a shadow of misunderstanding that these are actually Muslims who are trying to harm our country. So what's your response to this?
I understand and sympathetic to the definition of jihad within various strains of Islam. And I will say that over the last several years, the context of jihad has expanded beyond the reference to it in certain strains of Islam to mean a number of things. And throughout the world, for better or for worse, jihad at this point in time is believed by many to represent terrorism. It's a shame because that is not what is intended in Islam. We understand that. But those are the realities of life, unfortunately.
Your anti-terrorism work is obviously very information dependent. From time to time, there's been criticism in newspaper columns about the level of capacity in the computer systems that the Bureau works with. Are you satisfied with your present level of computer capacity? And if not, what are your plans?
First off, no, I am not satisfied by our current level. We have made substantial progress since September 11th in putting in the computer systems, the numbers of computers, the databases, the wide area networks, the local area networks. And often overlooked is the infrastructure that we have established so that we have in appropriate databases the capability to run the searches against those databases with the latest in search engines to get us the information we need. We had a case tracking system that we wanted to bring online. I pushed hard. I was impatient. We could not bring it online. It turned out it was not going to work. And consequently, we now have a contract with a very good contractor and a phased-in process for our case tracking system. And that will be, the first phase will be in within the year, and then we have 3 phases beyond that. I'm comfortable and satisfied with that contract and the progress we're making, but I am always impatient to have had that progress the day before as opposed to someplace down the road.
Thank you, Director. We've heard a great deal in our war on terror overseas of the successful information we've got from informants within terror cells or our ability to infiltrate those terror cells to get the actionable intelligence. To what extent are we doing the same thing domestically with these homegrown terror cells, and has it been successful?
Over the 98 years of our existence, key to the success of the Bureau, regardless of the program, is the ability to identify and utilize sources. The successes we had against organized crime is generally dependent upon sources. And consequently, when it comes to a subject as serious as the threat of terrorism, absolutely. We have developed, and with the agency, developed sources overseas and within the United States, as we have in the past, do now and will in the future, focus on sources as being one of the keys to preventing terrorist attacks.
Director Mueller, you talked at great length about the sources of terror both in this country and overseas, and you also mentioned 9/11, which I think most of us agree was originated in Afghanistan with the Taliban and with Osama bin Laden. My question is, to what extent do you think we'd be more secure today if instead of sending 100,000, 150,000 troops into Iraq, we'd sent that same number of troops into Afghanistan?
Well, I'm going to, as you can well understand, stay away from some of the political questions that you may have out there. I will tell you, I will on the other hand, tell you that I do anticipate that we'll find bin Laden. It is very tough and rough territory, and it's not always the number of men, it's the intelligence you've got, it's the sources you can develop, which will lead to the success in terms of apprehending somebody like bin Laden.
Thank you very much. Today we're talking about terrorism and emerging threats. One community that stands to lose most if there was another terrorism event like 9/11 or CS Tower or whatnot is the Muslim community. So you already have a community that is all dedicated in its best interest that anything like that does not happen. What are we doing when we grandstand these events either in Toledo or in Florida or wherever, and we pin the label on these Muslims or Islamic community, and then you have airwaves buzzing on talk radio, newspapers and whatnot, this practically hate speech asking for expulsion of Muslims, beheading of Muslims, killing them, dropping bombs and doing this and that. What are we doing? 3, you need Muslim participation in the law enforcement, not as necessarily paid informants, but people who are part and parcel of the law enforcement. Since 9/11, what percentage increase have we seen in the law enforcement agencies of people of Muslim persuasion?
Let me start with agreeing with you on the fact that the community was as devastated as any in the wake of September 11th was a Muslim community. When I sit and talk and meet with Muslim American leaders, the Arab American leaders, Sikh American leaders, the discussion goes to we should be joined together because your community suffered as much as any. And it is your community as well that needs to identify those who espouse a radical fundamentalist predication to the potential terrorists and either address it or bring it to our attention. Now, the facts are such that the Muslim community has been involved. Now, let me put it another way. Persons affiliated with the Muslim community have been involved in a number of the most recent attacks. You can start with Bali, you can go to Madrid, you can go to London, you can go to the arrests in Canada. You cannot dispute those facts. The bottom line is we have to work at it together. When I talk about unity, I'm talking about unity with the Muslim community, and we both have responsibilities. And so we encourage the exercise of those responsibilities on both sides and the continuous meeting and outreach on both communities so that we can accomplish the mutual goal, which is prevent this happening again, because if it does happen again, the community that will be most devastated is the Muslim community.
Director Mueller, you answered a question earlier about the tension that you feel deciding whether or not things are appropriate to do to protect us in light of the Constitution and the protections that that affords our citizens. Can you give us an example of something that was proposed to try to protect us that was thought to be effective but was not done because it went too far?
Really, I can't discuss, because it never became public. It would be inappropriate for me to discuss that which may have been discussed in the hallways of the Department of Justice, the FBI, or the administration. So that question I'm going to have to defer on. Thank you very much.
Today, at the City Club of Cleveland Forum, we have been listening to Robert S. Mueller III, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.